who got you those flowers, Jamira? Namjoon asked, his voice a dangerously soft rasp that vibrated through the minimalist silence of the foyer. He was standing over the marble console table, his knuckles white as he gripped the small, handwritten card that had been tucked into the stems. I realized in that heartbeat that my employer, the most lethal head of a Korean crime syndicate, wasn't asking because he cared about my social life. The way his hands trembled as he crushed that innocent piece of cardstock told me that the man who controlled the city's underworld was about to lose his grip on reality over a bouquet meant for someone else. And there you have it. This is a story of a forbidden romance that started with a spark of jealousy and ended with a promise of forever. If you are obsessed with powerful, dangerous men losing their composure, housekeepers who hold their ground, and love stories that burn with intense passion, you are exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button right now because we have more of these high-stakes forbidden romances coming your way. From mafia kings to billionaire protectors and the women who bring them to their knees, we bring all the tension you crave. Smash that like button and drop a comment letting me know what you're doing right now. Are you listening while you work, during your late-night commute, or are you tucked away in bed? Tell me which country you're tuning in from. I love knowing where my romance lovers are across the world. Jamira Lux was still smiling as she arranged the fresh stems into a crystal vase. The flowers were stunning, deep, velvet red roses intertwined with pristine white lilies, arranged with a level of care that spoke of deep, personal intention. They had arrived only 30 minutes ago, delivered by a courier who had insisted on seeing her personally, treating the delivery like it was the most precious cargo in all of Seoul. And to Jamira, maybe it was. The note tucked inside had made her let out a genuine, airy laugh, a sound that rarely echoed through the cold, pristine halls of Namjoon's estate. She reached out to adjust a lily, her dark skin a beautiful contrast against the white petals. Her hair was pulled back into its signature sleek ponytail, and her traditional black maid's uniform, with its crisp white collar and lace headband, looked immaculate as always. She felt lighter than she had in months, momentarily forgetting the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that usually came with serving a man like Namjoon. That was when the heavy oak door of the study swung open. Jamira looked up, her smile still warming her face, but she felt the joy freeze in her chest the moment her eyes met his. Namjoon stood in the doorway, perfectly still, like a predator who had just caught a scent he didn't recognize. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit that fit his broad shoulders with lethal precision, his black silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. At 34, he possessed the kind of face that demanded total submission, a sharp, angular jawline, dark, intense eyes, and features that would have been breathtaking if they weren't so terrifyingly controlled. A glimpse of the dark ink on his neck served as a constant reminder that he wasn't just a businessman, he was a man who lived and breathed in the shadows of violence. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply stared at the vibrant red roses in Jamira's hands, his expression shifting from his usual icy indifference into something far more volatile. The air in the room grew thin, heavy with a brewing rage that made the luxury of the mansion feel like a gilded cage. Jamira had spent a year being his shadow, staying invisible and following every rule, but as Namjoon stepped toward her, his eyes dark with a possessive fire, she knew the professional facade was gone forever. To live in Namjoon's mansion was to live in a cathedral of silence, and Jamira Lux was its most devoted acolyte. Every morning before the sun managed to crest the jagged skyline of the city, Jamira was already moving through the halls with the grace of a ghost. Her life was governed by the rhythm of perfection, the exact temperature of his morning tea, the precise angle of the newspapers on his desk, and the invisible boundary she never crossed. She was the invisible shadow, a woman who had mastered the art of being present without being noticed. As she moved through the vast, minimalist living area, the soft soles of her shoes made no sound on the polished white marble. She stopped for a moment in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror to check her reflection, ensuring everything was in its proper place. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail so sleek it looked like polished onyx, not a single stray strand defying the tension. Her black uniform was pressed to a razor edge, the white ruffled collar standing out against her deep complexion like a halo. To Namjoon, she was a tool, a highly efficient, beautiful piece of the architecture that kept his life running while he managed the bloody logistics of his empire. Jamira took pride in this invisibility. In the beginning, it had been a survival tactic. Working for the head of a syndicate meant seeing things one shouldn't and hearing whispers that could get a person buried. She had learned early on that if she remained a shadow, she remained safe. She kept her eyes down, her smile polite but distant, and her personal life locked away in the small, comfortable staff suite in the North Wing. For a year, she had been the perfect housekeeper, an expert at reading the micro-expressions on Namjoon's cold, handsome face. She knew when he was brooding over a deal gone wrong by the way he gripped his crystal glass, and she knew when to disappear before his temper could find a target. But as she dusted the obsidian surfaces of his private library, Jamira felt the weight of his presence long before she heard him. Even when he wasn't in the room, the house felt saturated with him, his scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco, the heavy, dark energy of a man who held the power of life and death in his hands. She smoothed the lace of her headband, her heart fluttering with a familiar, suppressed rhythm. She told herself it was fear. She told herself it was the natural reaction to being in the vicinity of a predator. But deep down, in the places she didn't allow herself to look, there was a thrill in being the only person allowed to walk so closely to the center of his storm. She finished her rounds, ensuring the minimalist decor was undisturbed. There was no room for clutter in Namjoon's world, just as there was no room for error. She checked the clock. It was nearly time for his afternoon briefing. Everything was ready. The house was a masterpiece of order, and she was the silent artist who maintained it. She was safe in her role as the shadow, hidden behind the black fabric of her dress and the professional mask she wore so well. She had no idea that within the hour, a simple delivery of red roses and white lilies would burn that mask to ashes, forcing the man in the navy suit to finally see the woman who had been standing right in front of him all along. The afternoon sun was just beginning to dip behind the sharp glass towers of Seoul when the chime of the estate's gate broke the heavy silence. Jamira moved to the entrance, expecting a delivery of documents or perhaps the imported tea Namjoon preferred. Instead, she found a courier holding an oversized bouquet that seemed to pulse with life against the sterile, white-on-white backdrop of the foyer. Deep, velvet red roses were clustered around stalks of pristine white lilies, their fragrance so thick and sweet it felt like a sudden intrusion of heat in a house made of ice. As she took the flowers, Jamira's professional mask slipped for the first time in a year. A small, handwritten card was tucked deep within the petals, the ink scrolling her name in a familiar, bold hand. She didn't need to open it to know who they were from, but she did anyway, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the short, intimate message. A genuine smile, radiant and wide, transformed her face, making her dark eyes sparkle with a light that had no place in a mafia boss's mansion. She looked like a woman who had been remembered, a woman who existed outside the walls of her employment. For a fleeting moment, she wasn't the invisible shadow or the perfect housekeeper, she was simply Jamira. She carried the bouquet toward the kitchen, her steps lighter than they had ever been. She found a crystal vase and began to arrange the stems, her hands moving with a gentle, rhythmic grace as she adjusted the lilies to catch the light. She was so lost in the vibrant colors and the memory of the sender that she didn't hear the heavy click of leather soles on the marble behind her. She didn't feel the temperature in the room plummet until the air itself seemed to thicken with a suffocating, dark energy. Namjoon stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the sharp, modern lines of the hallway. He was motionless, his eyes fixed on the flowers with a laser-like intensity that bordered on the predatory. To anyone else, he might have appeared merely curious, but Jamira had spent 12 months studying the minute shifts in his temperament. She saw the way his jaw tightened until a muscle pulsed in his cheek. She saw his hands, usually so steady and controlled, curl into tight fists at his sides. The navy fabric of his suit jacket strained across his broad shoulders as he took a slow, deliberate step into the kitchen. The joy that had filled Jamira's chest moments ago curdled into a cold, sharp anxiety. She felt his gaze move from the roses to her face, searching for the remnants of the smile she hadn't been quick enough to hide. Namjoon's rage wasn't the loud, crashing kind, it was a silent, pressurized storm that filled every corner of the room. He looked at the flowers as if they were a personal insult, a breach of his high-security walls that he hadn't authorized. The contrast was startling, the housekeeper, soft and glowing with an unexpected gift, and the Mafia boss, vibrating with a possessive fury that threatened to shatter the very peace she worked so hard to maintain. The warning was clear: in this house, there was only room for one man's influence, and anything that brought her happiness from the outside world was a target. The following days were defined by a suffocating, arctic silence that stretched through the halls of the mansion like a physical weight. Namjoon did not mention the flowers again, but his presence became a shadow that followed Jamira into every corner of the estate. The invisible boundary she had spent a year maintaining was suddenly gone, replaced by a calculated, brooding proximity. He stopped retreating to his study after dinner, choosing instead to linger in the common areas, his dark eyes tracking her every movement with the cold precision of a predator watching its prey. Namjoon began to invent reasons to keep her near, his commands delivered in a voice that was low and dangerously controlled. Tasks that usually took an hour were suddenly extended by his sudden, meticulous demands. He would point to a shelf that had already been polished and claim he saw a speck of dust, or insist that the entire library needed to be reorganized by publication date rather than subject. Each chore was a tether, a way to ensure that Jamira remained within his sight long after her shift should have ended. He was reclaiming his territory, asserting his dominance over her time and her attention in response to the joy those red and white blooms had brought into his house. By the time the clock struck midnight, Jamira would find herself kneeling on the cold floor of the gallery, meticulously hand-cleaning the baseboards while Namjoon sat in a nearby armchair, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't speak. He didn't look at the tablet in his lap. He simply watched her. The silence was so thick it felt like it might shatter at the slightest sound. Jamira kept her head down, her sleek ponytail dipping low as she worked, but she could feel the heat of his gaze burning into the back of her neck. It wasn't the look of an employer, it was the look of a man who was losing his grip on a facade he had spent a lifetime building. The emotional arc of the house shifted from the quiet efficiency of a workplace to the high-voltage tension of a standoff. Jamira felt the exhaustion deep in her bones, but beneath the fatigue, a new, sharp awareness was blooming. She was no longer invisible. Every time she caught the glint of the light on his neck tattoo or heard the ice clink in his glass, she realized that her 3 rules of survival were failing her. She was being pulled into the center of his storm, trapped in a game of psychological warfare where the only prize was his absolute control over her. As she finally rose to leave for the night, her muscles aching from the forced labor, she glanced at the kitchen counter where the vase of roses and lilies had once sat. It was gone. In its place was a single, obsidian-colored box with no note. Namjoon didn't acknowledge it as she walked past him, his expression a mask of charcoal-colored indifference, but the message was clear. He would tolerate no other influence in her life. He was the boss, the master, and now, he was becoming her captor in a prison of his own making, fueled by a jealousy that was rapidly spiraling out of his control. Saturday morning brought a fragile sense of relief as Jamira stepped out of the estate's heavy iron gates, trading her black maid's uniform for a simple, form-fitting sundress. For the first time in a week, she wasn't under the stifling gaze of Namjoon or the oppressive luxury of his minimalist walls. She headed toward a bustling open-air market in the heart of the city, desperate to lose herself in the crowd, the noise, and the normalcy of everyday life. She wanted to remember who she was before she became the focus of a mafia boss's obsession. She moved through the stalls, picking up a piece of fruit here or admiring a bolt of fabric there, unaware that a sleek, black SUV with tinted windows was idling half a block behind her. Inside the vehicle, Namjoon sat in the rear seat, his fingers tapping a restless, violent rhythm against the leather armrest. He told himself he was there for security, that a woman of her beauty was a target in a city where his enemies lurked in every shadow. But as he watched her laugh with a street vendor, the tightness in his chest told a different story. He realized with a jolt of territorial fury that he couldn't breathe properly when she was out of his reach. Jamira stopped at a small cafe, sitting at an outdoor table to enjoy the rare Seoul sunshine. When a young man approached her to ask for directions, Namjoon's hand instinctively went to the door handle, his jaw locking so tight it ached. He watched the stranger's eyes linger on Jamira's radiant smile and the elegant line of her neck, and for a moment, the civilized man in the navy suit vanished, replaced entirely by the predator who ruled by blood. He hated that the world could see her. He hated that she could give her light to anyone who happened to walk by, while he had to manufacture chores just to earn a glance. The stalker-like surveillance continued for hours, a silent tether that Jamira began to feel in the small of her back. She turned several times, her ponytail whipping around as she scanned the traffic, sensing a familiar, heavy energy nearby. The city felt smaller than usual, the air growing thick as if a storm were following her movements. She wasn't just his employee anymore, she was becoming his oxygen, a realization that terrified Namjoon even as it fueled his need to reclaim her. As the sun began to set, Jamira headed back toward the mansion, her shoulders slumped with the weight of the invisible pursuit. She arrived at the gates just as the black SUV pulled into the driveway behind her. The window rolled down just enough for her to see his dark, intense eyes. There was no greeting, no explanation for why he was there. He simply watched her enter the house, his expression one of hollowed-out relief. He had brought her back into his world, but as he stepped out of the car, Namjoon realized that following her hadn't cured his jealousy, it had only proven that he was now a prisoner of his own desire, unable to exist in a world where she wasn't exactly where he could see her. The following Monday, the heavy silence of the mansion was punctured by a sound that felt like a gunshot in a library, the persistent, melodic ringing of Jamira's personal cell phone. She had left it on the marble counter of the kitchen while she attended to the linens upstairs, a rare oversight born from the sheer exhaustion of the previous week. But Jamira wasn't the one who reached for the device. Namjoon was already there, his shadow lengthening across the pristine kitchen tiles. He had been lingering near the doorway, his presence as silent and oppressive as ever, when the screen lit up with a name he didn't recognize but instinctively loathed. He didn't hesitate. His fingers, adorned with a heavy silver signet ring, swiped across the screen with a lethal elegance. He didn't speak. He simply held the phone to his ear, his breathing so shallow it was non-existent. On the other end of the line, a man's voice, warm, familiar, and brimming with the kind of affection Namjoon had never been allowed to express, poured into the room. The caller spoke of the roses and lilies, asking if they had brightened her day and mentioning a Saturday dinner they needed to catch up on. He sounded like a man who belonged in the light, a man who believed Jamira was his to claim. The transformation in Namjoon was instantaneous and terrifying. The billionaire boss mask he wore for the public didn't just slip, it incinerated. His jaw locked with such force that the tendons in his neck strained against his skin, making the dark ink of his tattoo appear to writhe. His eyes, usually a cold, calculating brown, turned into twin pits of obsidian. This was the Mafia side of him that the city feared, the man who didn't negotiate, but destroyed. "She won't be making it to dinner," Namjoon finally said, his voice dropping to a register that was less of a human sound and more of a low, vibrating growl. The warmth on the other end of the line died instantly. "And if you ever send another flower to this address, you won't just be losing your connection to her. You'll be losing everything else you value." He ended the call with a sharp flick of his thumb, but the rage didn't dissipate. Instead, it localized. He gripped the phone so tightly that the glass threatened to spiderweb under his strength. He was no longer the controlled head of a syndicate, he was a man possessed by a primitive, territorial jealousy that defied all his logic. Jamira entered the kitchen moments later, her footsteps faltering as she took in the scene. She saw her phone in his hand, and more importantly, she saw the look in his eyes, a raw, unchecked hunger for dominance that she had never seen directed at her before. The room felt smaller, the air vibrating with the aftermath of his threat. Namjoon didn't apologize. He didn't offer an explanation. He simply stepped toward her, the phone still clutched in his hand like a trophy of war, his silence more eloquent than any shout. The message was sent, the rival was silenced, and now, the battle for Jamira's heart, and her soul, was moving into its most dangerous phase. The tension that had been simmering for a week finally reached its boiling point in the dead of night. Jamira was in the library, replacing a series of heavy, leather-bound volumes, when the double doors creaked shut with a finality that made her heart hammer against her ribs. She didn't have to turn around to know he was there. The air always changed when Namjoon entered a room, it grew thick, charged with a magnetic, dark energy that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "You were going to go to dinner with him," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to echo off the mahogany shelves. Jamira turned slowly, clutching a book to her chest like a shield. Namjoon was leaning against the closed doors, his tie loosened and the top buttons of his shirt undone. It was the most unraveled she had ever seen him. The controlled, icy businessman was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes were dark with a raw, predatory hunger. "That was my personal business, sir," she replied, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain professional. "My contract says nothing about my life outside these walls." Namjoon let out a short, humorless laugh that sent a shiver down her spine. He moved toward her then, his steps slow and deliberate, closing the distance until she was pressed back against the cold wood of the bookshelves. He placed a hand on either side of her, pinning her into his space. The scent of sandalwood and expensive scotch was overwhelming. "You think this uniform makes you invisible?" he whispered, his gaze dropping to the white ruffled collar of her dress before snapping back to her eyes. "You think because you pull your hair back and keep your head down that I don't see you? I see every breath you take in this house, Jamira. I see the way you smile at those damn flowers and I realize I haven't felt a single moment of peace since the day I hired you." He reached out, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her jaw with a touch that was surprisingly tender, yet possessed the underlying strength of a man used to taking what he wanted. Jamira's breath hitched. The invisible shadow she had built for herself was crumbling. For a year, she had convinced herself she was just a ghost in his mansion, but the heat radiating from his body told a different story. "The uniform doesn't hide a thing," Namjoon growled, his face inches from hers. "It doesn't hide the way your skin glows in the moonlight or the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. I've spent months trying to stay in control, trying to remember that you're staff. But seeing you with those flowers, knowing another man thinks he has the right to touch what is mine." "I'm not yours," she whispered, though the conviction in her voice was wavering. Aren't you? He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. You live under my roof. You eat my food. You breathe my air. Every inch of this house belongs to me, Jamira. And I'm starting to realize that includes the woman who runs it. The professional distance that had protected them both for a year was gone, incinerated by the look of pure, unadulterated want in his eyes. He wasn't the boss anymore, and she wasn't the housekeeper. They were just two people trapped in a collision of suppressed desire and dangerous jealousy, and as Namjoon's hand moved to the nape of her neck, Jamira realized that the man who controlled the city had finally lost control of himself. The heavy silence of the library was no longer a weapon used to keep Jamira in her place, it had become a shared space, vibrating with the sudden, raw proximity of their bodies. Namjoon's hand remained at the nape of her neck, his touch a searing brand against her skin, while his dark eyes searched hers for a sign of surrender. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, his entire empire secondary to the answer he was hunting for in the depths of her gaze. Why him, Jamira? He asked, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that felt foreign coming from a man of his stature. Why did he get to see that smile? Why did he get to make you laugh when I have given you everything in this house? Jamira let out a shaky breath, the book she had been holding slipping from her fingers and thudding softly onto the carpeted floor. She looked up at him, no longer seeing the terrifying Mafia boss or the demanding employer, but a man who was profoundly, desperately lonely in his tower of glass and steel. He didn't give me everything, Namjoon, she whispered, using his name for the first time, the syllables feeling like a forbidden prayer on her tongue. He just gave me a moment where I wasn't a shadow. I only accepted those flowers because I wanted to feel seen. I've spent a year in this house being a ghost. I thought I was invisible to you. I thought I was just the person who made your tea and kept your secrets. Namjoon's expression shifted, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his features before his grip on her neck tightened slightly, pulling her closer until their foreheads rested against each other. Invisible, he repeated, the word coming out as a pained exhale. Jamira, I have spent the last 12 months memorizing the sound of your footsteps. I know the exact moment you wake up because the house feels alive again. I've sat in my study for hours pretending to work just so I could watch you move through the gardens. You were never a ghost. You were the only thing in this tomb that was actually real. The revelation hit Jamira with the force of a physical blow. She had spent a year building walls, convincing herself that her attraction to him was a one-sided madness, a dangerous daydream born of proximity. She hadn't realized that while she was watching him from the shadows, he had been doing the exact same thing, trapped in his own cycle of silent observation and suppressed longing. I didn't think you cared, she admitted, her voice barely audible. You were always so cold. So controlled. Because if I let myself look at you for more than a second, I knew I would lose this. He gestured vaguely to the room, to the house, to the life he had built on a foundation of ironclad discipline. I'm a man with 1,000 enemies, Jamira. Caring about someone is a death sentence in my world. But when I saw those flowers, when I realized someone else was trying to take the only thing that matters to me, I realized I'd rather burn the world down than let you belong to another man. In the dim light of the library, the hierarchy of the mansion finally dissolved. The king was showing his wounds to the one person he was supposed to keep at a distance, and the housekeeper was realizing that her invisibility had been her own illusion. They were no longer master and servant, but two souls finally admitting that the professional masks they wore had become nothing more than a shared lie. The tension in Namjoon's shoulders began to bleed away, replaced by a desperate, grounding need as he leaned down, his lips inches from hers, waiting for the permission he had never had to ask for until now. The fragile peace of the library was shattered not by words, but by the sudden, rhythmic pulsing of a red light on the wall, the estate's silent alarm. The vulnerability that had softened Namjoon's features vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, lethal mask that Jamira had only seen from a distance. He didn't hesitate, his hand moved from her neck to her waist, pulling her behind him as he reached into the hidden compartment of a mahogany side table. When he turned back, he was holding a sleek, black handgun, his grip steady and practiced. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice no longer a whisper of longing but a sharp edge of authority. "Do not let go of my jacket, no matter what you hear." They moved through the darkened corridors of the mansion, the minimalist luxury now feeling like a battlefield. As they reached the high-security monitoring room, Jamira saw the screens flickering with movement. Men in dark clothing were breaching the perimeter, rivals who had sensed a moment of distraction in the formidable Namjoon. For the first time, Jamira saw the Blood King in action. He spoke into a radio, his orders concise and ruthless, coordinating his security teams with the cold efficiency of a grandmaster moving chess pieces. When the front doors were forced open, Jamira watched from the shadows of the upper mezzanine. She saw Namjoon step into the center of the foyer, bathed in the harsh light of the crystal chandelier. He didn't look like a businessman or a lover, he looked like a god of war. A man from the rival faction stepped forward, shouting threats about territory and weakness, pointing a finger at the upper floors where Jamira was hidden. Namjoon didn't wait for the man to finish. In a blur of motion, he disarmed the intruder with a brutal, bone-snapping efficiency that made Jamira's breath catch. He didn't kill the man, not yet, but he forced him to his knees, pressing the barrel of his weapon against the man's temple. "You thought because I was distracted, I was weak," Namjoon said, his voice echoing through the hall with a terrifying, resonant power. "You thought you could threaten what belongs to me and walk away. Tell your master that from this night on, the rules have changed. I am no longer just protecting a city. I am protecting my heart." Jamira watched as his men dragged the intruders away, leaving Namjoon standing alone in the center of the marble floor. He looked up toward the mezzanine, his eyes finding hers in the darkness. In that moment, the reality of her new life settled over her like a heavy velvet shroud. She was no longer just a housekeeper in a mansion, she was a marked woman in a world of blood oaths and ancient vendettas. To love him was to accept the shadow of the gun and the constant threat of the blade. He climbed the stairs toward her, his breathing heavy, the scent of gunpowder now mingling with his sandalwood cologne. He reached out his hand, and for a second, Jamira hesitated. She saw the blood on his cuff and the coldness still lingering in his gaze. But then she looked at his eyes, the way they softened the moment they touched hers, and she realized that the danger of the world outside was nothing compared to the danger of losing him. She placed her hand in his, an unspoken oath of her own. She was no longer a shadow, and she was no longer invisible. She was his, and as they walked back toward the safety of the inner sanctum, she knew there was no going back to the life she had known before the flowers arrived. The morning after the attack, the mansion was unnervingly still, but the coldness that had once defined its halls had vanished. The scent of gunpowder had been scrubbed away, replaced by the overwhelming, sweet perfume of 1,000 fresh lilies and roses that now overflowed from every vase in the house. Jamira stood in the center of the master suite, her hands smoothing the familiar fabric of her black apron. She reached up to adjust her white lace headband, her fingers tracing the symbol of her service one last time. For a year, this uniform had been her armor, her way of staying safe in a world that wasn't built for her. The door opened, and Namjoon entered. He was no longer wearing the charcoal suit of a businessman or the blood-stained shirt of a soldier. He wore a soft, black silk robe, his features relaxed in a way Jamira had never seen. He walked toward her, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath hitch. In his hand, he carried a small, velvet-lined box that caught the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A year ago, I watched you walk through these doors and I told myself you were just a housekeeper, he said, his voice low and steady, stripped of all the dangerous edges of the previous night. I told myself that as long as you wore that uniform and followed my rules, I was in control. But the moment those flowers arrived, I realized I was lying to myself. I wasn't in control of anything. You were the one holding my heart in your hands, and I was just a man terrified of losing the only light I've ever known. He stopped inches from her, his presence warm and grounding. He reached out, his fingers gentle as he untied the white lace headband from her hair. He set the scrap of fabric aside on a marble console, effectively ending the era of her invisibility. Jamira felt the weight of her ponytail drop, her dark hair cascading freely. I don't want a housekeeper, Jamira, Namjoon whispered. I don't want someone who hides in the shadows or waits for my command. This house is a fortress, but without you, it's just a cage. He opened the velvet box. Inside, resting on a bed of black silk, was a delicate, intricate tiara crafted from platinum and shimmering diamonds. It wasn't a piece of jewelry meant for a gala, it was a crown. With a steady hand, Namjoon leaned forward and placed it carefully on her head, the diamonds catching the light and throwing rainbows against her deep complexion. 6 months ago, I asked who got you those flowers because I was a man consumed by jealousy, he said, sinking to one knee before her. The most powerful man in the city, a man who knelt to no one, was looking up at her with a raw, honest vulnerability. Today, I'm asking if you will let me give you flowers for the rest of your life. Will you leave the uniform behind and take your place by my side? Will you marry me, Jamira Lux, and turn this mansion into a home? Jamira looked down at him, her eyes blurring with happy tears. She thought of the journey from the invisible shadow to the woman wearing a crown. She thought of the danger and the darkness of his world, and then she looked at the man who had burned his own walls down just to see her. Yes, she whispered, the word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken feelings. Yes, Namjoon. He slid a matching diamond ring onto her finger, his hands shaking slightly as he did so. As he stood and pulled her into his arms, Jamira realized that her life of service was over. She was no longer the girl who managed the estate, she was the queen who would rule it. The jealous boss had finally lost control, and in doing so, they had both found their way home. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.